Hi everyone, and welcome to Chapter 34, which focuses on digestion and nutrition. Now, this is one of the chapters that students tend to like because it is very relatable since, as the book says, everybody poops. And so you are very familiar with the concept of, eating and what happens with your own body. Now, before we go through the details of digestion, I want to point out that there are two types of digestive tracts that you should be aware of. And I'm a little bit bummed that I don't get to see your facial reactions because I love the faces that students make when I introduce the first type of digestive tract, which is an incomplete digestive tract. Now, when I explain this one, the key point here is with incomplete digestive tracts, the organism only has one opening, okay? So I'd like to pause and give you a second to really think about what that means for that organism. So if we were to call that one opening a mouth, well, think of it. They only have one opening. So the same opening deals with the entrance of food and the exit of wastes. Okay, so the example to think of for that one is planaria or flatworms, which you see in this picture here. And you notice it only has one opening. So kind of visualize that if you had an incomplete digestive tract, that would mean that after you eat your food, then poop would basically come shooting out of your mouth. Okay? Luckily for you, instead, you have what's called a complete digestive tract. And the complete digestive tract, what that means is you have two openings instead. You have a mouth and an anus, which means that one opening is able to be dedicated to the entrance of food, whereas the other one is able to be dedicated just to the exit of waste, thankfully. Now, when you think about these two digestive tracts, we already went over this, but I'll kind of review it again. You should know the examples and how do they differ. So the example of an incomplete digestive tract could be flatworms or planaria, whereas the complete digestive tract would be humans or even this earthworm here, any organism that has a mouth and an anus, which differs from the organisms with only one opening. Now, in addition to the different types of digestive tract, we also break down feeders into two types of feeders. There are the continuous feeders, which is not my brother pictured in the right there. Instead, the continuous feeder is the example of the whale that you see here. Another term for continuous feeders is filter feeders because these organisms tend to have nice big filters in front of their mouth opening. And what makes them continuous feeders is that water with food particles is constantly flowing through. It's always allowing food particles through their body. The big point here is that means that these organisms, continuous feeders, do not need a food storage area, okay? And what is a food storage area? Your stomach, okay? So continuous feeders constantly have food particles flowing through their body, so no need for food storage. Whereas discontinuous feeders, they will selectively eat. That means that they need a food storage area, meaning they need a stomach. Now, digestion can start in that food storage area, but it does not have to, okay? What is really significant, though, is that difference of continuous versus discontinuous. Continuous always has food entering, so no need for food storage, no need for a stomach, whereas discontinuous is selectively eating. They need a stomach, they need a food area. Now, with those different feeders, what's very important is if you're going to be feeding on something, you usually need teeth in order to break it down. Now, different organisms have different types of teeth depending on their dietary needs, and we call that a form of adaptation because they have adapted their teeth to be best suited for whatever kind of food they survive on. Now, there are three different types of organisms I want you to know of that have different types of teeth. There are herbivores, carnivores, and omnivores. And I want you to be very comfortable with what would each eat and what kind of teeth would they end up needing in order to eat that kind of food. So the first one is easy to remember because herbivores have the word herb in their name. So herbivores are organisms that will only eat plants. Now, if they're only eating plants, picture something that needs to cut grass. They need teeth that are good at clipping and grinding, okay? Kind of like you see in this picture here for the horse skull's teeth. You then have carnivores, and they eat only meat. And if they're only eating meat, that means they need sharp, big, and large teeth because they need to be able to tear flesh. So anytime you see very pointed, sharp, large teeth, make sure you quickly know that that is a carnivore. The last one are omnivores, and that's what we tend to be. Omnivores eat meat and plants. Now, because we have adapted to eat a variety of different types of food, that means we then needed to adapt a variety of different teeth. Our teeth need to be able to tear, chew, grind, basically handle any of the kinds of foods that we would encounter. Okay, so now I can basically describe a type of teeth, and you should be able to tell me which organism it comes from. So for instance, if I were to tell you that an animal has very sharp, pointed teeth, and I could phrase it as, archaeologists found a fossil or a skull with sharp, pointed teeth, then you should be able to tell me which type of organism was it. So send me a remind message once you get to this slide and tell me if they found a skull with sharp pointed teeth, would it be an herbivore, a carnivore, or an omnivore? Now, whenever we talk about science or any topic, people want to hear about people, right? You want to know what applies to you. So now we're going to focus on humans and their complete digestive tract. What goes on in your digestive tract. And I like this picture because it gives you a nice summary of all of the different main organs, starting with where digestion begins, which is in the mouth, all the way down to where it ends, which is in the anus. Now, what's also good is it breaks down on this side the accessory organs that produce important things to help your digestion go properly. Okay, and you will notice that I make the point here that human digestion is extracellular via digestive enzymes secreted from glands and organ wall linings. And a lot of those digestive enzymes come from these accessory organs over here. Okay, so some of these guys also produce digestive enzymes, such as you'll see in the stomach. But I put it on this side so you can associate the accessory organs with this as well. Now we're going to go step by step. The first part of your digestive system is your mouth. And, sometimes we take for granted the mouth in digestion, but it's actually very important because it contains many things that help us start to digest our food. So first off, there are three major pairs of salivary glands. Okay? And sometimes you hear the term parotid glands for salivary glands. Now, these salivary glands are very important because saliva contains salivary amylase. And I want you to circle, star, highlight salivary amylase because that starts digestion of starches, meaning the digestion of carbohydrates, such as this delicious looking pretzel over here, or pastas and breads, any of the carbs that you can think of. Digestion of carbohydrates start in the mouth, specifically with salivary amylase. So make sure you know that term and what it's doing. Now, in addition to your saliva, you also have teeth in your mouth. And what do your teeth do? Well, we just mentioned they tear, grind, and chew food. And what kind of teeth do you have? You have a variety of different kinds because you're an omnivore. Okay? The last part of your mouth that's helping with digestion is your tongue. And your tongue is made up of a whole bunch of muscles, which is important because not only does that help you speak, but it's important because your tongue helps mix the chewed food with saliva. And when that mixed chewed food is combined with saliva, we call that mixture a bolus. That's B-O-L-U-S. And so when you are talking about digestion in any pictures or figures of the textbook, when you hear that the bolus is traveling, let's say, through your esophagus or through your digestive tract, that simply means a big ball or clump of food mixed with saliva. After your mouth, food then hits the pharynx. And the pharynx is important because it's actually part of two different organ systems for you. It's part of your digestive system and your respiratory. So the digestive and respiratory passages meet at the pharynx. And basically what the pharynx is it has this soft palate that closes off the nasopharynx. And then it has an epiglottis. And your epiglottis is critical for you because that's a little flap, basically a little flap at the back of your throat that blocks your trachea to prevent food from entering the airways, okay? And that epiglottis, I want you to circle, star, highlight it. That epiglottis is why it is so important not to speak while you eat, okay? Because not only is it gross and you might spit food all over the place, but when you speak while you eat, think about any time you talk. What do you feel in your throat and your chest? You feel vibration, right? Because your voice box, you have that vibration creating speech. If you're speaking when you're trying to eat, that vibration from your speech will then open up the epiglottis. It will make the epiglottis pop off of the trachea, and food can then enter your respiratory tract, okay? You don't want food in your respiratory tract, right? You want to only breathe in air. You don't want a big chunk of food blocking your respiratory tract, okay? So that epiglottis is why you should never speak while you eat. Again, because it's also disgusting, just saying. Now, the next spot for food is the esophagus. And the esophagus is what is going to bring the food to your stomach. And that happens through peristalsis, which you can visualize in this image here. And you see the bolus, okay? So again, anytime you see bolus, what does that mean? Mixture of food and saliva that's getting pushed down the esophagus into the stomach through rhythmic contractions. So peristalsis is defined as the rhythmic contractions that will move the bolus or move food through organ tubes, okay, meaning through your esophagus. Okay, so it's that rhythmic contraction that you're seeing that's helping push the food down. And you can kind of think of it as when you're trying to get toothpaste out of the container, when you squeeze on the toothpaste to push it forward. That's what your esophagus is doing with peristalsis. It's squeezing the food down into your stomach. So the next part of this digestive tract is the stomach. And when the bolus, okay, I'm going to keep using that term so you remember what it means. When that bolus mixture of food and saliva hits the stomach, this is a very important part of digestion and your digestive tract. Now, the first point I want to make is that the stomach is lined with all of these deep folds instead of having a smooth kind of surface. That's very important for digestion because these deep folds basically remind us of earlier lessons when we talked about why it's valuable to have a bunch of small cells rather than one big one, or a bunch of small fingers, individual fingers, rather than one big hand. So when you look at all of these deep folds, it's the same concept of giving us more surface area, which is very important in the stomach where you want to start absorbing and breaking down various foods. So the deep folds are valuable with the function of increased surface area. And by having those deep folds, it also allows the stomach to expand. Okay? Now, what's very important about the stomach, in addition to that special lining that it has, is that it contains very valuable gastric juices. And those gastric juices basically include hydrochloric acid and pepsin. I'm going to focus on pepsin first because it's a very specific function that pepsin has. It is basically a hydrolytic enzyme that breaks down proteins into peptides. That's a fancy way of saying that I want you to circle that big capital P of pepsin, and anytime you see that word, remind yourself it's an enzyme that breaks down proteins. Okay, that's the key point with pepsin. Then you have HCl, which is hydrochloric acid, and that's not as specific as pepsin. HCl has a lot of different functions. First of all, it helps activate pepsin because it converts pepsinogen into pepsin. And so it helps with the digestion of proteins by helping you get pepsin. It also stimulates the release of bile and different pancreatic enzymes, which help in the absorption of fats and carbs. And on top of that, helps the absorption of vitamins and minerals. So whereas pepsin is just for breaking down proteins, HCl I want you to think of as something that helps with the digestion of proteins, fats, carbs, vitamins, and minerals, okay? Very valuable. And on top of that, when you think of hydrochloric acid, what do you think? Well, acid, that's a very potent pH, right? So that makes your stomach a very unfavorable environment to microbes or pathogens that might be hiding in your food. So HCl not only helps you digest and absorb all of those molecules we just mentioned, but it also helps prevent disease because it kills pathogens in your food thanks to its acidic pH. Now at this point you have a nice mixture of food and gastric juices, and what we call that is chyme. Okay, so this term here, chyme, that is a mixture of food and gastric juices, and that will now move where it exits your stomach and will enter your small intestine via a sphincter. And you have multiple sphincters inside your body, and even though most people think of their anus sphincter, you have more than one. That term simply means a contractile muscle surrounding a tube. Okay, so that's what's going to happen now. Chyme is now moving. So when the food left your mouth, it was a bolus because it was food mixed with saliva. Now it's called chyme because it's food mixed with gastric juices. Okay, so now the chyme makes it to the small intestine. And fun fact, I know when you hear small intestine, you're probably picturing a very small structure. But in fact, when you look at the pictures, all of this long crinkled up material here, that's the small intestine. And the shorter structure here, that's actually the large intestine. But the name difference is because even though the small intestine is longer than the large intestine, it is smaller in diameter. So small intestine is small because of its small diameter. But compared to the large intestine, it's actually larger. Now there's a term I want you to remember whenever you hear the duodenum. Okay, duodenum, circle, star, highlight that. That is the first segment of your small intestine. Okay, so sometimes you won't hear people write about or speak about the small intestine. Instead, they'll refer to the duodenum, basically where food is entering. Okay, and then you have the other terminology here. So duodenum is the start, jejunum is the middle part, and then ileum is the later part of the small intestine. Now, what happens here in terms of digestion? The chyme from the stomach enters at the duodenum, and it mixes with liver and pancreatic secretions. And there's quite a few secretions that I want you to know what they're doing. So first up, you have bile. And bile, is made in the liver and then stored in the gallbladder. And what bile is important for here is what we call emulsification. Okay, emulsification is when bile breaks down fats. Then at the same time, the pancreas is secreting a few different enzymes. It's secreting amylase, trypsin, and lipase. And if you think back to the beginning of the semester when we went over the biomolecules, specifically the ones that would be your nutrients, well, that'll help you realize that these three different enzymes have different functions in that amylase, you heard already in your mouth. Amylase digests starches to maltose. So amylase is for digesting carbohydrates, okay? So amylase for what? Digesting carbohydrates. Trypsin, okay? Trypsin is for digesting proteins. And then lipase. Well, lipase sounds like what? Lipids, right? Lipase digests fats into its building blocks, which were glycerol and fatty acids. Okay, so each of these breaks down a different biomolecule, a different nutrient. You have your carbs, proteins, and fats now broken down. And then the broken down nutrients are absorbed into the villi. And what the villi are is these ridged linings of the intestinal wall. Now again, why are the intestinal walls ridged? Well, just like with the stomach, it's increased surface area. So wherever you're going to have absorption, you want ridges, okay? They're not ridged for your pleasure. They are ridged for increased surface area. More absorption, more nutrients obtained. Now, to help you visualize that digestion and absorption, I threw in this little figure, and I want you to circle the enzymes we just talked about. So in the carbohydrate digestion, I want you to circle amylase so that you associate amylase with breaking down your carbs into smaller sugar molecules. Then I want you to circle trypsin for peptides and lipase for fat digestion. In the previous slide, I said that lipase and bile is involved in emulsification. You can circle that term. Emulsification means breaking down lipids, okay? So I was going to put a recap slide, but instead this slide helped you see the spelling of emulsification, okay, that we mentioned in the previous slide. Now, we've mentioned the liver a few times throughout this lecture, so I wanted to give you a slide summarizing some of the functions of the liver. And what I want you to do is circle star highlight the first one. The fact that the liver detoxifies, okay? Detoxifies, removing and breaking down poisonous toxic substances. Now, this is very important to remember because the more toxins that you put into your body, the more work you are giving to the liver and the more that you are destroying your liver. Because if you think about it, where do those toxins or poisons always end up going in order to be broken down? They go to your liver. So yes, the rest of your body ends up saved and not exposed to those poisonous substances, but who gets exposed to it? Your liver, okay? Because it is entering the liver when it is at its most toxic. And that's why alcoholics and drug users end up having such big liver problems, okay? The rest you can read through. It's basically different functions helped out by any enzymes produced. Then after the small intestine, now that food mixture and final, final products that you want at this point ends up making it to the large intestine. And the large intestine is sometimes described as being multiple parts, including the cecum, your colon, your rectum, and the anal canal. So a lot of people think of the large intestine or your colon as the exit, starting the exit of the digestive tract. It basically leads to the anus, which has the function of providing exit. But the large intestine is so much more than that. As I point out on this slide, the large intestine is basically the last chance for your body to grab whatever last-minute nutrients and water it can from that meal that you just took in. So the large intestine involves absorbing water, salt, some vitamins, minerals. It's that last chance to get every last bit of nutrient out of the food before it's gone. It involves mineral ions, such as grabbing whatever sodium and chloride the large intestine can. And sometimes it's thought of as the place for not just the formation of feces, but kind of a temporary storage, okay? You're not just, pooping everywhere at every moment. So the colon in the large intestine helps you temporarily store your fecal matter. And with that, there's also a big population of bacteria in that location. And you may think, ew, oh, that's a problem. I don't want bacteria in my body. But those are actually very good bacteria. In fact, there's sometimes over 500 species of bacteria in large intestines. And they're important for a few things. One, they are part of what's called your normal flora. So they help protect you by taking up space and resources so that pathogen bacteria can't really take over. They're also involved in fermentation activities and help you break down some indigestible materials. And that's why it's important to eat probiotics, to eat things like yogurt, because when you have these probiotics, it helps restore and give you a good collection of these good, helpful bacteria in your large intestine and digestive tract. Now, beyond that, the large intestine, like I just mentioned, is also the end point of digestion, specifically your anus, and that's the exit for waste and the true end point. Now, another thing that we do want to mention is when you look at a large intestine, you see this little flap hanging off. You see it over here in this picture as well. That little looks like a deflated balloon structure is your appendix, which some of you may have already had it removed, because sometimes it ends up, causing trouble for you. Now, people still argue over what the appendix is for, what its function is. The two main ideas is that one, it might possibly be involved with fighting infections by having that structure. Two, many people see it as what's called a vestigial structure from ancestors. Okay, so with either of these functions, with the first one possibly fighting infections, the theory is that the appendix might act as a storage house for good bacteria, basically helping to reboot the digestive system after you've lost some of your normal flora, meaning after you've had a whole lot of diarrhea or yuckiness. And the other theory is the vestigial structure theory, which basically means that it is just an end form of, something that used to have meaning for our ancestors, but with time lost its function and basically shriveled up and is useless. Okay, and then that's why they remove appendix, the appendix, if it's inflamed and causing dangerous problems, because it will not, cause any life-threatening problem if you do not end up having one. But it will be life-threatening if it is badly infected. Okay, so throughout this chapter, when you're studying, make sure you really understand the function of all of the different parts of the digestive tract and what's happening with your food every time you eat. And I hope that after you listen to this narration and this lesson, that you end up every time you eat, visualize what's happening to your food. Now, the other part of this chapter, I want to focus on nutrition. And some of this you may have encountered before in your everyday life. Now, when we talk about nutrients, that's basically substances in food that are the good things for you. They help with your growth, your development, your repair within your body in terms of cells and tissues. There are 6 main classes of nutrients. There are the ones that are included as macronutrients, and when you see macro, that means large, so you want to consume these nutrients in relatively large quantities. So the 4 that are included as macronutrients are water, carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins. Okay, so make sure you write macronutrients include water, carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins, and you want to consume them in large quantities. Whereas micronutrients, you only want in small quantities, and these are your vitamins and minerals. So be careful if you take supplements, try not to overdo it, because yes, you need vitamins and minerals, but only in small quantities. You also encounter the term essential nutrients, and what that means is any of the nutrients that cannot be synthesized in the body. And the main ones of those are your minerals, as well as some of the vitamins. And there are 9 amino acids that we're going to talk about, as well as a couple of fatty acids. Where your body can't make them, they have to be consumed in your diet. Now we're going to go through those nutrients one by one. The first one up are your carbohydrates. These are things like sugar, starch, and fibers. And the big sources of these are going to be fruits and vegetables. Okay? You also have milk and honey listed there, so don't be afraid, in terms of, trying to completely cut those out of your diet when you're trying to avoid having too much sugar. You basically in life want the natural sources of sugars rather than added sugars. So always check that on nutritional labels. Sugars are basically termed either monosaccharides or disaccharides. Okay? The monosaccharides are glucose and fructose, whereas the disaccharides are lactose, which you find in milk, and sucrose, which you find in table sugars. And then throughout digestion, those disaccharides get broken down into monosaccharides, okay, especially into glucose. So make sure you remember glucose as an important monosaccharide. Now, we mentioned already how those carbohydrates are getting digested. So remember the enzyme amylase. So amylase in the mouth helps start the digestion, and then in the duodenum, in the small intestine, there was also amylase. So in the mouth and the small intestine, you were getting a lot of breakdown of carbohydrates. Now, when we talk about the breakdown of carbohydrates, keep in mind that the glucose produced can then be stored as stored forms of carbs. So for plants, they store glucose as starch. Whereas animals, we store glucose as glycogen. Okay, so either way, when you have carbohydrates, their main purpose for you is going to be energy. So whether you're storing them or you're just quickly breaking them down, it's a whole lot of energy for you. There's also another category of carbohydrates which are very important to have in your diet, and they're called fiber carbohydrates. The reason why fibers are so important is that they are undigestible. Now, I know you may think to yourself, well, if it's undigestible and I can't digest it, why am I going to eat something like that? Well, it has the benefit that it helps stimulate movement through the large intestine. So without getting too graphic and gross, it basically helps push out whatever you have in your large intestine, okay, because it's not going to be broken down smaller. Good food sources of these include things like beans, peas, nuts, fruits, and vegetables. And they're important in your diet because not only do they help move things along in your large intestine, but they've been connected to preventing heart disease. So if you think about it, soluble fiber basically can bind to bile acids and cholesterol. And you know cholesterol, you don't want that building up in your body. So the fiber helps bind to the cholesterol and prevents it from being absorbed. So having a high fiber diet is very important for proper nutrition. Now, when we talk about nutrition, one of the food groups that students tend to focus on are proteins. You know, it's all about those gains. Now, with proteins, proper protein building in your body requires 20 different amino acids, but what's important about them is 9 of those 20 are essential amino acids. And what did we say essential nutrients means? It means your body cannot create them. It means you need to get those 9 specifically from your diet, okay, from diet or supplements. Now, good sources of proteins are meat, milk, and eggs, because unlike vegetables, meat, milk, and eggs are food sources for all 20 amino acids, whereas vegetables tend to be missing at least one of the essential amino acids. And that's why vegetarians and vegans need to make sure that they combine their plant products properly in order to obtain all of the amino acids they need. If you are not a vegetarian or vegan, however, eating milk, meat, and egg products greatly help in making sure that you get all of your essential amino acids. And again, remind yourself, amino acids are the building blocks of proteins in your body. Now, just to review, we've mentioned protein digestion throughout your digestive tract, and this is just to help remind you that in your stomach is where a large part of protein digestion occurs through the enzyme pepsin, which plays an important role in terms of breaking down those proteins. And then in the duodenum, you had those other enzymes, including trypsin, and ones that I didn't mention yet was elastase, and sometimes a different form of trypsin called chymotrypsin. So whenever you see trypsin, elastase, chymotrypsin, remember that all of those are enzymes that help break peptides into smaller peptides. They help break down proteins. Okay, so always be sure to pay attention to any enzymes we talk about and know what their function is. In addition to carbs and proteins, you also have lipids as an important part of your daily, nutrition. I know a lot of people are usually afraid of fats, oils, and cholesterols, but in small amounts they are important because they have the purpose of supplying energy for cells. Now, the problem is that when they are in excess, they then end up getting stored. Now, when it comes to lipids, specifically fats, there are 2 categories to remember. There are unsaturated fats and there are saturated fats. And unsaturated fats are essential. These you usually find in fish and plant oils. And the unsaturated fats are the ones that, like the term says, they are not saturated because they have those double bonds that can be broken, and they are the ones that are not able to be stacked up on top of each other because of their structure. Remember, they have that boomerang shape. So you end up having less stacked fat, whereas saturated fats are those flat ones that we saw in pictures in previous lessons, and those are the ones that can stack up and clog various parts of your body. They tend to come from animals, but can also come from coconut and palm oil. So be careful if you have too much coconut oil and palm oil. Yes, they're healthy in small amounts, but in high quantities, they are a lot of saturated fat. And the problem with saturated fats, like I said, they stack on top of each other. And they are very bad for the heart in large amounts because they can start clogging arteries and various tubes that in your body that you want proper flow going through. Now, with these, things like butter and meats, cheeses, egg yolks, and meats, and dessert sweets, they all tend to be high in saturated fats. So yes, you don't want to completely cut them out of your diet, but always remember small portions. Now, just to review lipid digestion, we've again mentioned this throughout the digestive tract, but to remind you, lipid digestion, when we talked about it, began in the stomach. It began with lipases, So we call them a lot of times gastric lipases. Sometimes you see it as lingual lipases, but don't worry about that. But the bulk of lipid digestion actually occurs in the small intestine. And so that's where you see the duodenum. That's the beginning of the small intestine. And the reason why a lot of lipid digestion occurs there is because of pancreatic lipase. And so when chyme enters the duodenum, the release of bile is triggered and the pancreatic lipase, and both help break down lipids. And again, the breakdown of lipids, the way you see it in digestion, is called emulsification. Emulsification. And ultimately, at the very end of this emulsification, the broken down lipid globules tend to be in little clumps that we call chylomicrons. So when you see chylomicrons, that's usually digested lipids. Now, to help you understand terms that I'm sure you hear all the time but may not know the difference between them, there are different types of what we call lipoproteins. And so when you get your lipid testing done, things like cholesterol, and they say, oh, are you high cholesterol, low cholesterol, all that stuff, you're usually looking at lipoproteins. There are three main categories. There are VLDLs, LDLs, and HDLs. VLDLs are very low density lipoproteins. They transport triglycerides to your peripheral tissues, mostly adipose. Then the two main terms that you hear all the time, and I want you to circle, star, highlight, are your LDLs and your HDLs. And a trick to remembering what each of these does is next to LDLs, for that L, I want you to write lousy. Okay, these are the lousy bad ones. Whereas HDLs, circle that H and write healthy. HDLs are actually the healthy, good ones. So the reason why LDLs are bad for you, they're lousy, is they transport cholesterol to your peripheral tissues from membranes, which means that they transport cholesterol to be stored in your body. And yes, you need some cholesterol for hormone synthesis and for your body, but you do not want a lot of LDLs because high levels of LDL will be associated with increased risk of heart attack because now you are storing a lot of cholesterol in your tissues. Okay? HDLs, on the other hand, are the healthy good guys. And high levels of HDLs are actually thought to protect against heart attack because what these healthy good guys do is they transport excess cholesterol away from the peripheral tissues, away from your tissues, to the liver to be broken down and secreted into bile, meaning LDLs are associated with storing cholesterol in your body, whereas HDLs are involved or associated with getting rid of it. Okay, so those are the good guys. They're better for you. You need a little bit of cholesterol, but you don't want a lot because then it can clog up your arteries and cause health problems, especially with the heart. Now, when we talk about cholesterol levels, okay, I summarized a little bit of what I was saying in the previous slides. Saturated fatty acids, you can think of this idea as the lousy, the LDLs. This is now the bad form where you get creation of basically deposits, plaques, building up on your blood vessels, clogging up, hardening, causing things like atherosclerosis, which is the hardening of the arteries. And we're going to see this in the cardiovascular chapter as well. Okay, so that's if you have a whole lot of saturated fatty acids, whereas unsaturated fatty acids is like the HDLs, the idea of excreting, getting rid of the cholesterol from your body. Now, trans fat, you see a lot of advertisements for foods and products that are zero trans fats. That's a thing because you don't want a lot of trans fat. They increase the LDLs, the bad storing cholesterol stuck in your body, LDLs, and they reduce the HDLs, which are trying to help get rid of cholesterol in your body. If you want to do the opposite and you want to help lower your LDLs and increase the good HDLs, I highly recommend drinking green tea daily. Green tea also helps block your allergy receptors, which we'll talk about in another chapter as well. The last thing when it comes to cholesterol levels that I want to point out is the unsaturated omega-3 fatty acids, and you find this a lot in fish, especially in salmon. You hear this associated with. And omega-3 fatty acids, one of the good things about them is they lower the proportions of saturated fats and cholesterol. And the goal is always to lower the amount of cholesterol in your body, excrete it, rather than storing it. So anything involved with cholesterol that is bad because it's storing cholesterol in your body, allowing plaques to gather, which leads to things like atherosclerosis. Write that down as hardening of the arteries, as well as increased chance of stroke or heart attack. Whereas good things for cholesterol will always help get it out of your body, excrete it. Now, those were the macronutrients. I just want to spend a minute focusing on the micronutrients, including vitamins. Now, we see here most function as coenzymes, and we've seen that word before. Coenzymes help activate enzymes, and they tell you that that molecule is organic. Okay, so vitamins are organic and help activate your enzymes for proper metabolism, meaning for all the reactions in your body. Now, there are many different vitamins, ones such as vitamins D, a few of the B vitamins, and K can be synthesized in your body. So, for instance, when they tell you to get a whole lot of sunlight to boost your vitamin D, and then in the wintertime, when you don't tend to get as much sunlight, a lot of people end up with deficiencies in vitamin D. Okay. The rest of the vitamins you tend to have to take supplements for, or simply focus on the foods and nutrients that you're taking in daily in your diet. Now, when we talk about vitamins, there are two categories I want you to be familiar with. There are water-soluble and fat-soluble. Circle, star, highlight which is which. So make sure you know that BC, I think of it as BC as in the timeline, so as in years. So BC are your water-soluble, whereas fat-soluble are A, D, E, and K. Okay? Now, what's important with the difference in those guys is that water-soluble means vitamins that can dissolve in water and are easily absorbed. That's important because it means that they're not getting stored. So water-soluble vitamins end up excreted through your urine and thus are not usually toxic because they can't gather in your body. You excrete out the excess. So B and C you can take in as much as you like, and you'll pee out the excess without having to worry about toxicity. Fat-soluble vitamins, on the other hand, those dissolve in fats and break down like lipids. That means that they require the bile acids to be dissolved, for these vitamins to be dissolved and then absorbed. And these fat-soluble ones end up getting stored in your body. Now that means that if you take too many of those, whether it's in your diet or in supplements, if you take too many of the fat-soluble ones, they can accumulate in your body, they get concentrated, and then it can end up being toxic to you. So you could end up overdosing on them or getting vitamin poisoning. So please make sure you know which of these vitamins on this slide are water-soluble and which are fat-soluble. In addition to vitamins, you also need your minerals. And instead of being called coenzymes, these are called cofactors. And remember, we said you can picture a factory with metals and smoke and brick, because cofactors means minerals. It means inorganic molecules. But they do the same thing as coenzymes in that they help activate enzymes. So they're important for your metabolic reactions in your body. So building things up, breaking them down. Here I list out multiple examples for you so you can think of, the different minerals that you want to get in your diet and supplements and how they help you with things like making sure you have proper bone health, making sure you're getting oxygen the way you're supposed to, and even things like helping with hormones and blood function with electrolytes. So minerals are very important. Then before we finish out this chapter, I kind of want to point out the concept of diet and obesity. Now here, proper nutrition is very important no matter what age you are. I think sometimes when you are college level, you kind of think you're invincible, but you are not. And what you do to your body now comes back to bite you on the butt years and years later. Okay, now in the average daily calorie intake, you usually hear 2,000 calories, but that actually depends on age, gender, things like how active you are. So you need to kind of think about your lifestyle, your age, and figure out what the best calorie intake is for you. Now, when you're trying to lose weight and get fit, you can reduce your caloric intake, but try not to drop below 1,200 calories a day, because that ends up being counterproductive and can trigger what's called starvation mode, where your body will start trying to store fats. And so instead of shedding the fats and shedding the weight, you'll end up gaining the weight, even though you're eating very, very little, because your body goes into starvation mode. So I always recommend to people, think biologically. Rather than reducing the calories too low, it's always better to simply increase your activity, because you want to make sure that you are burning more calories than you're taking in if you're looking to lose weight. I also highly recommend the free app called MyFitnessPal, and I swear I'm not getting paid to do this. It sounds like an infomercial. But the MyFitnessPal app, it helps you track your calories throughout the day. And so if you're trying to lose weight, it'll kind of help you set a goal such as 1,500 calories a day. And it helps you really visualize what you're taking into your body. And it helps you pay attention to what you're eating and drinking throughout the day, which is important because sometimes we take for granted how many calories can actually add up very quickly, and how many calories you may take in a meal, not realizing that, hey, that was actually a small amount of food, barely filled me up, but it gave me so many calories. So MyFitnessPal app really helps you kind of keep track of calories, and at the same time, you should always be sure to increase activity, because exercising is very important for your health, because things like type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular problems, things like heart attacks, and even now cancers are associated with obesity as high risk. So make sure to take care of yourself young so that you actually get to make it to the old years. Now, the last thing I want to focus on in this chapter is just briefly to point out regulation of food intake. What makes you full, what makes you stop eating. So there's short-term regulation of food intake, which involves neural signals, which means your nerves. So for instance, the vagus, spelled V-A-G-U-S. Vagus signals suppress the hunger center. So basically signals from your brain telling you, hey, I'm getting full, need to cut it down, as well as nutrient signals. And what nutrient signals means is you could end up with increased nutrient levels in the blood will then depress or decrease your eating desire. So things like blood glucose, amino acids, fatty acids, it's kind of like a negative feedback mechanism. So as you get those nutrients in your blood increasing, your body will be told, hey, we have our nutrients, let's stop eating for now. There's also important hormones for regulating food intake. These include glucagon and epinephrine, both of which stimulate hunger, so they make you more hungry. Ghrelin, So that's GHR, that's from the stomach, and that will stimulate your appetite just before a meal. So when you kind of start smelling the food and you start to get a bit hungry, that's ghrelin. And then PYY and CCK, those signal satiety, meaning those signal you feeling full, and basically it's a fancy way of saying they're appetite suppressors. Okay, so under glucagon and epinephrine, make sure you write that these will increase your hunger. They stimulate hunger. GHR will also increase appetite right before a meal, whereas these last two, PYY and CCK, these are both appetite suppressors. They decrease your hunger. You also have long-term regulation of food intake, and the big one for that is leptin. That triggers the feeling of fullness. And what leptin is it's a hormone secreted by fat cells in response to your increased body fat. And it acts on a hypothalamus and will basically suppress secretion of NPY, which is an appetite stimulant. Okay, so it's acting on your hypothalamus to decrease an appetite stimulant while also stimulating your appetite suppressants. Okay, so it drops down any appetite stimulants and increases any appetite suppressants to make sure you're feeling nice and full. You also have additional factors that will help prevent you from eating and keep you full, things like insulin, temperature, even stress. So think about if you're really stressed or having bad times, do you feel so, like, ugh, I just don't want to eat, right? Certain infections and even sleep deprivation can affect whether or not you feel the need to eat. And just to kind of summarize what I was talking about, so this gives you a breakdown of some of the short-term controls we mentioned. Make sure, again, to really emphasize any enzymes we talk about or hormones, what's increasing your appetite, what's decreasing it. And then long-term control, make sure you're really focusing on that leptin. And another example is insulin, okay? But we're not going to go through all the crazy mechanisms because, again, this is not, biochemistry class. It's just want to introduce you to the idea of diet and nutrition. The last point I want to make before we get into, having too long of a lesson, I know I try to keep these kind of, within a certain range so that you don't get overwhelmed. The last point I want to make is that everything is connected. So even though when you eat, you mainly focus on your digestive system, at the same time, things like your cardiovascular system and your respiratory system are all functioning together, okay? You have all of these gas exchanges occurring, all of this flow of your blood, and then ultimately the excretion of waste as well. So this slide here is just to show you that when you think of diet and nutrition, keep in mind that everything's connected. That's why exercise is also important. When you are increasing the amount you exercise and you're really getting your cardiovascular system and your respiratory system very strong, it ends up helping with your digestion as well. Okay, so always try to keep a good balance in terms of diet, exercise, all of that, because it helps all of your systems at once. Now that is it. As always, if you have any questions, any concerns, please make sure to send me them in the Remind app.